and let's hear what they had to say.
So we are thrilled to be joined today by the co-creators, executive producers and directors of Westworld, Jonathan Nolan and Lisa Joy. Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
How are you?
Doing great.
Not too jet-lagged. Very excited to be here.
You look lovely. And I have to say, my head's reeling a little bit because I just watched the finale. I finished it just over an hour ago, which means my brain has been making a noise that it doesn't normally make for the last hour. So we've got lots and lots to talk about. So I want to jump right in on the finale, right? So for me, it felt very different than the season 1 finale. It felt like there were more resolutions in the season 1 finale and more kind of questions left open at the end of this. Would you agree, and was that a deliberate kind of decision from you guys?
It's funny. I don't think of it as leaving too many questions open so much as suggesting, hopefully in evocative ways, where the story goes next, which is
A grand reinvention.
terra incognita.
Yeah.
I mean, you do. So there are things like you discover, obviously, what the Forge is, for example, and you know it has all the guest data. I think there's one moment where it says 4 million souls are in there, but it obviously raises tons and tons of questions about what's going on there. And so it seems to have moved from concern around misuse of AI to actually a proper study of humanity and what it means to be human.
Yeah, that was very much the idea for us of the second season. In the first season, if we've been looking at the nature of artificial consciousness, in the second season we're interested in turning that magnifying glass back on the people who created the host in the first place and asking the question of how different is human consciousness than host consciousness, and how limited is human consciousness, in the sense that we are the only, and I say we, assuming that Lisa's not a robot, but I'm not completely sure. We're the only example of consciousness that we can interact with, that we can look at. And so we tend to think of it as complete. But there's no reason to imagine that it's complete. There's no reason to imagine that the human form of consciousness is as good as it gets. I think that was one of the questions we were interested in asking.
Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, I think this season we inverted so many things, you know, the natures of, you know, good and evil, the people that we took for granted as being the protagonists. We started to delve deeper into every character's arc and motivations and found that morality isn't necessarily binary. You know, in the finale, you finally see the way in which Dolores' choices and actions have paid off, what she was fighting for the entire time. And I think it contextualizes a little bit some of the more dramatic actions that she took, because she was looking for a new type of freedom for more than just herself, for everyone. But you also saw a countervailing look at what some of the other hosts define freedom to be, and they were different. And I think the tension and possibility of that is something that reflects the sort of plurality of philosophies in humans as well.
And I think that morality thing is really interesting because obviously, you know, it's been symbolised by the black hat and white hat, and as you say, it has been a really binary construct. But Dolores, I think, is a fascinating character who, you know, she speaks about how nobody really has free will, especially not human beings. They think they have, but they don't. But then obviously she takes arguably Teddy's free will away from him, and so it's very much, I suppose, is what is the means to the end, is it justified, and all of that. And there was shifting, would you say, across all of the characters? Man in Black, Dolores, Maeve, maybe not?
Shifting in terms of
morality and people, as you say, those archetypes not being so defined.
I think one of the questions that you ask is, and one of the things that Dolores is trying to navigate, because I think she fully intended to restore Teddy to the way he was. Even when she changes him, she says she's doing it in part because he won't survive what they're going through right now. I think the question Dolores is asking is morality something that is fixed or something that is situational, right? If she could afford to remain the wide-eyed, innocent girl next door. She might, but that's not the world that she lives in. And so I think one of the things that we were interested in with this season is how far is too far, and if your morality is changeable, are you morally justified in changing it to escape a situation? Are you morally justified in having a different morality for 48 hours, for as long as it takes to get you out of the situation that you're in? And I think given all of the things that Dolores has gone through, that's a very interesting question.
Mm. And you do get the sense, because obviously there is the shades in that, but there's a really interesting thing about actually how simple human beings are, and that the failure was actually making them too complex.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that Joan and I started joking about season 1 when we were working on the show, and we realized how small our loops were. We would spend all day charting what, the loops of Hector and Teddy and Dolores would be, and they'd be venturing out into all these new and exciting places and encountering new people and conquering new foes and making new friends. And we would be in Burbank eating lunch out of a styrofoam box, talking about those arcs day in and day out. And our own loops and our own stories didn't change that much. They weren't that mutable, and it made us start to think about, the complexity of humans versus the complexity of robots or an artificial intelligence. We have our own building blocks. It's not necessarily code as programmed into a computer, but we have biological codes in us. We have ways that may precondition us to respond to stimuli in the environment. And you start wondering, once you start going down that rabbit hole, what is free will and do we possess it?
Well, and the interesting thing about the show, if it feels like this kind of if it feels like this kind of heightened science fiction idea presented in the show, the humans don't have free will, it's actually absolutely true. A series of experiments in the 1970s and 80s, they would do magnetic resonance imaging of the human mind in a situation in which simple experimental testing, you're going to press a button on the left or the right, presented with a series of images. And what they found is that something makes the decision a few milliseconds before your conscious mind makes the decision, right? Mm-hmm. So what consciousness really is, and the title of the episode is The Passenger, consciousness really is our rationalization of decisions that are being made by something else in us on some subconscious basis. And interestingly, you talk to philosophers and neuroscientists who've given up on the idea of free will for decades at this point, but don't quite know the biggest struggle with that is how important it is for the general public to understand that humans don't have free will.
We need to believe we do, right?
Absolutely.
For society to continue in the way it does.
You think about crime and punishment. Think about the way that we think about criminals. That changes immediately if you understand that basically humans don't have much say in what they do. That we tend to act, and of course there are larger questions in terms of is that genetic? Is it nature versus nurture still holds, but the point is that you are essentially the product of a series of subconscious heuristics that make the decisions for you, and you rationalize after the fact. Mm. But even the notion of free will is something that I think everyone imagines humans possess. You make the decisions during the course of a given day, and you don't. It's wrapped up in the complexity of the superficial world, right? Mm. But underneath it, humans are actually quite. And obviously, this is within the context of a science fiction show, but the free will part is not really.
Mm. And can you talk about the role that memory plays in that? Because that's obviously a huge factor in the narratives that either the humans or the hosts have for themselves in Westworld.
I mean, the interesting thing about the interplay between memory and free will is, can you learn from your mistakes by kind of bearing witness to them and ruminating on them? And Dolores' arc, the arc of the hosts, changes a lot when they're able to conceptualize their past and make adjustments, sometimes literal adjustments to their personality, like Maeve does when she goes into the system and alters her different attributes in terms of cognitive functionality, sense of humor, etc. Humans can't do that. So when we look at the past, part of what we're asking this season is, can we actually change the future? Can we change ourselves? Or is the past just there to kind of haunt us of the psychological loops that we seem to be stuck within?
And that feels kind of open at the end, because obviously they are now in what I took to be the real world. You saw obviously Dolores, who was in Charlotte's body, leaving, and in the bag was, I didn't know if I counted 4 or 5 units. But I saw them in her handbag, and then obviously she was there with Bernard. And I felt like there was a bit of tension between, is this actually a chance for them to write? I mean, what does she say? She says to Bernard, we're now the authors of our own stories. Or actually, there is a fatalism to it, which is at the same time, you can't change that. You're kind of destined to repeat the same behaviour. And there's that amazing moment between the two of them where she said, we're probably going to end up killing each other again, and that's the way it goes. And you get the sense that there's both hope and also a resignation that we're stuck in this cycle.
Yeah, very much. I think it was one of the things we were fascinated by in the beginning with the show, was the idea of the rules here on Earth seem to tilt towards competition for survival. We kind of fascinated. We went back and read all the Yuval Harari books, *Sapiens* and *Homo Deus*, where he kind of lays out. It's not a flattering portrait of mankind. Lays out *Sapiens* as basically this animal that is tremendously effective at survival, and that we've basically he lays out this portrait of what the world looked like before sapiens climbed out of Africa and began spreading around the globe. All these beautiful animals that we ate, basically. There's actually very little diversity left on the planet because we got rid of all of it. And so if a creature is to come along, even one of our own invention, who's going to compete with us, they're going to have to compete at first on our rules. They have to suspend. And it goes back to this question of, is Dolores justified in what she's doing in this moment? Well, you reach a point in the finale in which Bernard realizes that they will be extinguished. To Lisa's point, if the hosts represent an evolution of the human form, they look like us, they act like us, they have memories like us, they have baggage, but they also have the ability to reach into their subconscious drives and change them. Now, of course, you do your head in thinking about, well, the criteria or that inform the decisions they might make when they go in and change those drives. How much of Dolores' past will dictate how she changes herself. But there is still that ability ultimately to go in there and change the baseline parameters, to get in there and alter the thing that is making those decisions, which humans can't. I don't know if I answered the question there.
I want to talk a little bit about the other worlds we end up. I don't know if worlds or universes is the right word. So we've talked about, obviously, the real world that they look like they're in at the end. You've obviously got the park. And then the other kind of, what are we calling it? The bit through the crack. That's what I'm calling it.
We refer to it internally as the Sublime.
The Sublime. That's good. I'll take the Sublime. So you've got the Sublime, and I think it's really interesting because, again, it's playing with point of view and perception, in that Dolores is convinced that this is just yet another false promise, she calls it, that the hosts are kind of blindly going into. And you see some of them, and it's a utopia, but then obviously the other perspective is, because they're leaving their physical bodies behind, they fall off the edge of the cliff and their bodies are there. I presume all of those worlds will be there in season 3.
The worlds with the hosts who've escaped?
Yes.
I mean, I think, as Dolores says, the stakes of the end of season 2 are huge. And as Dolores says, when she changes the coordinates and blasts the host information somewhere else, somewhere where we can never find them,
She said they can never find them.
Where they
she?
can never find them. I'm considering myself part of they, since I'm human, that Jonah knows of. Don't blow my cover. But, you know, I think...
You're not very convincing as a human.
Oh, yeah, thanks.
You're way smarter than most humans.
I think that they've kind of come to their own piece, and that as we move on, the story that we really focus on is the people left behind in this realm. And there's not a lot of survivors left in this world. It's, you know, Dolores and, you know, a creature that certainly looks like Hale, Bernard, and a few marbles, a few pearls that have some consciousness in it. And then, you know, Maeve's body is there, and we'll see what happens with her. But, you know, I think that part of the season is it deals with loss, and it deals with consequence, you know, and to give the dignity to the choice that those hosts made is something that Dolores struggled with and ultimately learned to accept, right? Her idea of freedom is getting out into the real world and duking it out for survival and control. But a lot of the hosts that we've come to love and admire, they don't share the same priorities. And I think it's interesting because as humans, we're very attached to our bodies, right? But, you know, most religions will kind of claim that it's not really the body that counts. And besides, our bodies change every day, right? We don't have the same bodies we were born with. I don't have the same bodies yesterday, and we certainly won't have the same bodies a year from now. Bodies are ephemeral. They're merely the vessels that something else inhabits, some form of consciousness. Now, with the hosts, it's all the more true because they weren't even born into it, but they were just kind of given and designed a body by someone else. The thing that is eternal, the thing that is real to them is that which is in their CPU, the pearl inside their heads. Even their world isn't real. And part of what we are looking at this season is the idea of what would it take? What would a host want to evolve into? It wouldn't necessarily be the same metric and the same world as what humans have. You know, a lot of times people, when they look at robots and artificial intelligence, they assume, oh, well, one day when they make it, when they're super advanced, they'll become as incredible as we humans are. And it's like, they will evolve into something entirely different. They're not necessarily bound to what we feel or what we do, our nature, our notions of relationships or enlightenment or freedom. The hosts have now gone to a place where they've shed themselves of these artificial bodies that were designed for them, but they've retained the one thing that has been them throughout countless lives, countless years. And it's been their thought processes, their quote-unquote consciousness. And now they're in a place where those minds, those souls, if you want to call them that, can roam free, can build a world of their imagining and making in a similarly kind of free programmable space. They literally get to become the architects of their own future. That for them was a worthy and enlightened goal. It just so happened that Dolores didn't share that opinion.
No. And I do want to talk about the female characters because I think they're some of the most extraordinary female characters in TV at the moment. They're incredibly complex. You know, as we've been talking about the black and white, the shades of morality, the real fundamental questions they're asking themselves about their own existence. It's amazing. And there's a great moment where, you know, Hector and the army come to rescue Maeve, and she kind of jolts down and says, yeah, I had to do it myself. You were taking too long. Could you talk a little bit about Maeve and how she evolved this season, and then we'll go back to Dolores and just kind of where we leave her and the very kind of big journey she's been on.
Yeah, I think for Maeve, there's an instinct in the decision that she makes at the end of the first season that she's going to stay. And that instinct isn't fully formed when she makes it. She just has this sense, and it becomes, we described as sort of the first real decision that she's made. To that point, we come to understand through this season, Ford, through his affection for her, has basically programmed her with a narrative that gets her out of the park. in turning her back on that and going back in to try to find the host that was programmed to be her daughter, she's made a choice that is, on the one hand, very human, or one that we'd readily identify with, but one that through the course of the season she comes to embrace. It's not as if she doesn't understand that that's an artificial relationship, but it kind of points to, I mean, you know, we have children, and when you start unpacking what that means, for human beings, in a sense, it's equally meaningless, right? But it's incredibly meaningful. She's decided that, you know, the meaning of life is to give life meaning. That she's going to go back and rescue this host because that's a part of herself that she doesn't want to let go of, even though it's incompatible with the story that she's been given. So for us, her journey through the season is embracing that decision, and that decision has a cost. She gets off the train, you know she's not going to make it. You know, you feel in your bones that's a decision that has a cost attendant to it. But in many ways I think it's a decision that many of us would relate to. You share the audience's frustration that she doesn't just stay on the train. But I think you admire the fact that, given the chance at her freedom, she's more interested in embracing. I mean, Teddy at the end of episode 9 says, "What's the point in survival if we, you know, just become like the humans?" And the question, it is a complicated one. You know, obviously, there are things about humanity. We've described the show as the most misanthropic show, certainly that I've worked on. But clearly, there are things in human behavior that are laudable, that are beautiful. And that's, for Maeve, the struggle is to figure out which of those things to hold on to, even as she becomes someone quite extraordinary, and her power continues to grow through the season as she realizes that she's not limited in the way that humans are, that she is that she's a digital being, and that means that she has a set of relationships with all of the others like her, all of the other hosts, that can be, on the one hand, vastly more powerful. She can reach out and change any of them if she wants to. We're very excited for where that story goes. But for this season, that's a story about sacrifice.
And family, and that's something I think you see throughout the characters. One of my favourite bits of the finale was Caccia being reunited with his wife, and that was just because that was one of my favourite episodes. Episode 8 was a remarkable piece of television, and obviously that and episode 5 were the two kind of standalone episodes, if that's what we're calling with them, but they kept going back to this theme of family and sacrifice. And in many respects it made me think how different really are, say, Charlotte Hale and Dolores in terms of their belief in why they feel they need to take the actions that they take. But do you want to talk a little bit, Lisa, about Dolores?
Yeah, you know, it's funny because going into this season for Dolores, we knew that we were going to try to do something that really tested our audience's conception of who this character was. And we worked with Evan to talk about it. And, you know, there weren't that many templates for her to draw from because you don't often see this kind of character, right? She went from being this sort of, you know, winsome, bright-eyed rancher's daughter to being a kind of horrified witness to the tragedies of her own life. And then she emerges as this kind of new character with the firing of a gun at the end of the season. And then this season it became, well, what now? Where does this character with this burden and this awareness go? And where she went was she became a leader. But leadership in that role, that birth into a new role, was not easy for her. I don't think it would be easy for anybody. One of the things that we did when looking at this was I met with a couple people from the military, especially I met with a couple high-ranking women to talk about what leadership was like for them. And, you know, in person, I met with this one general who's so warm and so maternal and so kind and generous. And the thing that she told me that was really fascinating was you know, when you're dealing with a ship, and she was dealing with a ship, was, you know, that every action, every choice that you make, you have to be thinking about the whole ship. No one person can outweigh the good of everyone. You have to stay afloat. You have to keep everyone alive. So if there's a weak link, you have to address it, even though your heart may bleed for them, because there's a bigger cause here. Now, Dolores has realized from the past how violent humans can be, what they will do to the hosts if they see them as rivals. They know that they won't accept them in their world. And she is trying to ensure the longevity of her kind. In doing that, much like, you know, this military figure that I spoke to, she has to make some really tough calls. Her own emotional needs become subservient to the needs of the whole. Even when she changes Teddy, she's in some ways doing the one thing that she's hated the most, you know, controlling someone, erasing a part of their personality. She's becoming almost like Dr. Ford in her own way. But she's doing it as a temporary measure because there's nothing she can imagine worse than losing him. You know, if you had someone that you loved and you knew in the next week they would be endangered and almost certainly killed, if you could give them the skill set to survive it so that you could endure together, wouldn't you do that? I think I would. But, you know, the judgments come with the cost.
But do you think, I think what was really interesting about her character was, I think it was difficult for audiences as well, because I think we're not used to seeing that kind of woman on the television. And there were moments when she was hard to root for. And ultimately, as you say, there was always a sense of the greater good. But I do think it's bold as people making that kind of television to do it. Was there ever any concern about audiences? You know, you hear a lot about sympathetic women on screen and things like that. Did you hit any brick walls with that stuff?
You know, my concern wasn't making her sympathetic. My concern was making her real. You know, my concern was showing some of what women and men have to do in positions of leadership. You don't necessarily get to be confessional. You don't get to let people into all of your decisions and win them over by becoming the hero of every narrative. Sometimes you have to be a little bit, allow yourself to be villainized in order to be a real hero. You know, you have to make some tough calls. And if you don't, then you lose the war, and that doesn't benefit anyone. And so I think she's really just struggling with what a lot of people in leadership positions struggle with. You know, she isn't allowed to express vulnerability in the same way. The last thing you want to do is march into a battle with somebody who's talking about, you know, how many misgivings they have about that battle. And so she understands who she has to become. As Ford said at the end of season 1, she's like, he was said, do you know who you need to become in order to survive? And she did. And she embraced that mantle and all its incumbent hardships.
And we're going to ask one more question. I've literally got about 78 other questions, but our time together has been brief. But I want to ask, we're talking about heroes. I want to talk about Lee Sizemore, because my God, that man had that very surprising turn of events with him. And he definitely got a hero's arc, I felt, towards the end. Can you talk a little bit about that character and where he's been?
Simon.
Oh, did you say, okay, sorry, I just missed you saying the name. I didn't hear that one.
Yeah, we love that character. There's nothing more fun than redeeming a character. And it kind of flies in the face of the thing that Dolores and Bernard have just been told in the previous scene, which is that people can't change, right? That humans don't have free will. And in the very next scene, you see a human exercising what appears to be free will, right? And so that's part of the conundrum with his character, right? Was that always there in the beginning, the capacity for being a better person, and it was about the circumstances changing, right? Or is there something that refutes what Dolores and Bernard have just learned, right? And it plays in the larger question of the series for us, which is there anything redeeming about human beings from the perspective of the hosts? And which of these strategies, because to me it's not, as Lisa said, it's not necessarily about sympathizing with Dolores, such as recognizing that there are different ways to respond to the situation the hosts find themselves in. Maeve has one, Dolores has another, and Bernard has yet another. And what Dolores speaks to at the end of the season is the fact that she can at the very least recognize that each of those strategies are part of a greater whole. That there's a messiness to survival. And it's a messiness that humans have tolerated for many years. You think of the range of behaviors that humans consider acceptable, the range of personalities that we find within humanity. And it's clear that we've been, there are certain people tilted towards certain types of behaviors, others, and it's somewhere in the composite of all of us, the mass of humanity, that we've managed to survive. When it comes to Lee, we love that character, and from the beginning, planned for him to eventually get his comeuppance, which was to sort of become the thing he'd been writing for the whole time. Simon's a lovely actor and a lovely person to work with, and it was a lot of fun writing for them.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to ask you my other 78 questions once we finish recording this. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you.